You might associate Indian cinema with the vivid color, rich culture, traditions, riveting narratives, compelling characters, and yes, a lot of dancing. But did you know that the heart of all Indian films primarily emphasizes on the abundant influence of westernized culture? Essentially, the conventional constructs of Indian cinema has permanently been defined as an integral part of Indian culture, as each film traditionally features different aspects of India, exemplifying the foremost culture, religion, and language. However, as time passed, the fundamental structure of Indian films has foreseen formidable modernized influence significantly accentuated due to the impact of globalization and localization. The globalization is defined as a process of rapid economic, cultural, and institutional integration among countries, while localization is essentially defined to describe a product or service that is developed and distributed globally but is adjusted to accommodate the user or consumer in a local market. Furthermore, recognized filmmakers in Indian cinema are compelled to adopt distinct Western traditions in their films for the principal purpose of attracting foreign audiences rather than their original Indian audiences, by signifying the transnational influence of global media and popular culture on Indian cinema and by reflecting Marshall Llewellyn's idea of global village. The notion of Indian cinema has seemingly rectified its paramount influence from the Hollywood film industry as far back as the 1950s. In fact, the established name of the Indian film industry, Bollywood, inevitably derives from Hollywood, a reflection of the significant strides to be on par with Hollywood cinema. The first Indian film dates back to 1913, as quintessential film was substantially viewed by audiences for the rudimentary purposes of escapism and entertainment, as a minority of films implemented social issues in their films, since most Indian films primarily consisted of only romantic musicals and melodramas. The 1950s era foresaw massive transformation in the storytelling themes in films as inspired by Hollywood, as most films produced began to express and illustrate social themes of dealing with the working class urban life in India and highlighting considered taboo subjects in India, with the inclusion of divorce, same-sex marriages, and affairs. In continuation, paramount Western trends such as rock and roll, rap, disco began to influence Indian film, as well as the traditional clothing and dances that illustrated Indian culture were supposedly replaced by the sex and glamour of Hollywood, whereas traditional dance of India began to diminish and replaced by pelvic thrusts and bobbing heads of Hollywood. The representation of global media has depicted India's shifting relation with the world economy, but is required to retain the Indian touch in moments of dynamic hybridity. Essentially, Indian cinema has begun to show a productive hybrid relation between the local and global, and have begun to help illustrate the national identity within new formed cultural perimeters in the areas of fashion, location, and music. The fundamentals of fashion have been a major key of influence adapted into Indian cinema, as popular fashion magazines amplifying examples of Vogue often publish Indian editions to feature distinguished Bollywood stars and models to reflect a shift in the types of costumes and clothing being designed for Indian production. The resurgence of cable television has enabled Indian audience to be exposed to a plethora of fashion and style-based channels, with filmmakers illuminating the importance of emphasizing fashion for the marketing of a Bollywood film, and highlighting Indian styles in film have themselves been subjected to a fashion interpretation. An article examined by Amy Villaretti recognized the immensely popular Indian actresses during the 1970s who refused to don attire that was identified as Western, revealing, or considered sexual. Additionally, Amy highlights the variation in the types of traditional Indian wear, such as a sari, worn by actresses, as the outfits were historically reflected the cultural meaning of nostalgia, tradition, womanhood, and nationalism. Overtly Western clothing, such as short skirts and tight pants, were attire for younger female actresses who personified the urban and modern taste of society. As India ancestry embraced global refinement, representation of men and women wearing Western culture were no longer marginalized in films. However, audience members accept Western clothing styles in films but also perceive for the Indian touch. The World Economic Integration brought about by global treaties and transnational organizations, including the World Trade Organization, has allowed for the emergence of market-driven and advertiser-supported consumption on a scale that has been quite unprecedented. These established modifications have enabled mobility in travel and tourism among the growing Indian middle class. As more Indians travel and live abroad, Indian films have expanded their settings and has initiated filming at a variety of natural found and purpose-built locations similar to Hollywood. Within the past 15 years, the increasing availability and affordances of film technology around the world has compelled filmmakers to film in more than 4 to 5 different countries, and sometimes audience can witness scenes change within the span of a 1 to 3 minute song. The geographically diverse settings of Bollywood films are populated and domesticated by characters who mostly speak Hindi. Essentially, it is a rarity to have natives of the places enter the narrative of the film. The illustration of an increasing emphasis on the international settings does not involve the people and cultures of those settings. Instead, these spaces and geographies and implicitly cultures are Indianized by local Indian film actors, actresses, and extras speaking Hindi in these films. The notion of song and dance lie in the heart of Indian cinema and has been recognized and appreciated by audiences universally. It has maintained its unique film structure with the implication of song and dance numbers by both stylistically and economically. Songs in Indian films are ideally purposed to express hidden feelings and emotions which could not be otherwise be expressed in words. Audiences are extremely conscious of the role of music in Indian films and recognize that Indian film music has changed with the advent of global television. An article expressed by Shakuntala Rao congregates her understanding on the revolution of music in Indian films, from starting from classical and slow to now primarily featuring dance music and pop. Subsequently, earlier Indian films contained songs that had a very traditional aesthetics. Essentially, the primary alteration in music have eminently categorized by the audiences in two ways. The first accentuating the changes in the lyrics of the songs, which now include a mix of Hindi and English words, while the second spotlighting the changes in the type of music genre, giving an increasing influence of global music trends such as salsa, pop, and hip-hop. Rao also acknowledges that English as a Western and global language has entered mainstream Indian films, with recent Indian songs containing English, Spanish, and French words, and shows that song lyrics have indeed been reinforced with localization by inserting foreign words into mostly Hindi lyrics. In continuation, Indian film songs are currently pre-released and played on Indian MTV and all other music channels prior to the release of the film, primarily influenced by MTV-style music videos which came to India in the mid-1990s. The dance numbers include a large group of dancers consisting of women primarily originating from an Eastern European background, while globalization has created a niche for the Indo-Anglo actresses. Moreover, the foreign dancers in Indian films are often performing the most sensual dance moves and primarily in more revealing costumes. Additionally, Indian films have integrated the MTV style of dance borrowed from the Western MTV music videos. The Indian touch remains in the way that actors and actresses are perceived as pure by the overt sexualization of the other characters. Indian films have always appropriated the latest trends in world music, particularly pop and disco in the late 1970s and 1980s. The presence of global music styles, musicians, and formats in film songs increasingly steadied, with audiences recognizing the various genres that are being integrated in Hindi film music. Inconclusively, the influence of globalization and localization of Indian cinema has been apparent stemming from the advent of film fashion, locations, and music bestowed in distinguished Indian films. Essentially based on the increase in Indian migration, contemporary Bollywood filmmakers are now catering to the demands of the Indian diaspora and therefore a more global market, whilst highlighting the impact of globalization and localization on the Indian diaspora and the manner in which this translates into the narrative and representation of westernization in Indian cinema, heavily highlighting the influence of the idea of Michael Lewis's global village.